Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon if you're in Asia, good morning if you're in Europe, and if we happen to have any participants from the Americas, then good late evening to you as well. Um, Very warm welcome from myself. I'm Christoph Sowski. I'm assistant professor of linguistics at the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Prince of Songkla University in Hat Yai, which, if you don't know where that is in the south of Thailand. And you're very welcome to this symposium on Beyond the Native Speaker, Perspectives from Across Applied Linguistics. We've got three really exciting visiting speakers joining us today, and I hope we're going to have a lot of fun and critique as well, yeah? Let me just talk a little bit about why this symposium. First of all, why this kind of event, why this symposium, and then why the four of us, let's say. Well, the idea behind this kind of event in general is basically to try and find ways to open up academic discussion. I don't know what everyone's experiences have been if you're sort of in academia as a professional field. In my case, I've started to find conferences a little bit of a frustrating experience at times because they are quite closed off in some way. There's a lot of people who can't participate. These kind of events, this is the second one that we're doing at our faculty. These kind of events are basically intended to try and open things up, to bring more people into the loop and sort of bring world-class scholarship, which I think we have in abundance here, to more than the usual people in conference halls. Another goal for this event in particular is to try and get applied linguists talking. I think all of us here, we would say we're applied linguists, but we're from quite different fields of applied linguistics. We've got Jean-Marc Deval, who is sort of on the border of, shall we say, language acquisition, second language acquisition, also working a little bit in what we might call sociolinguistics. Talia Isaacs has done a lot of work on language assessment, but also health communication, all kinds of interesting things. Li Jin Choi working on learner identity, especially, and especially identity of bilingual learners. And myself, the work that I've done has been really on the teaching profession and on inequalities in recruitment of teachers. And sort of one thing that's probably, pretty obvious in applied linguistics now is that people from sort of different subfields of this huge mega field often don't get to talk very much. We have our own conferences. People who do what I would say what I do is something like applied sociolinguistics, rarely get to talk to people in language assessment, and are often appalled at the conceptual differences that we find between our fields. And also there's the issue of the gap between academics and academic research and practitioners, people who do teaching on a daily basis, which I would think among our audience, there will be quite a few. Certainly, if you are an academic in Thailand, chances are that you are an applied linguist who also teaches language in your daily professional life. And the topic that we've chosen for this event is really one of the ones where we probably should talk more, which is this thorny concept of native speaker, which, I'm thinking, what are the other sort of fundamental concepts in applied linguistics that are quite so widely used? The one that I could think of is probably language, which, where there's also probably huge discussion to be had about how do we define language in different subfields of applied linguistics. Native speaker is certainly one of these, where in some parts of the field, it's used quite on a daily basis, uncritically, yeah. In others, it is almost a taboo word nowadays. So there is definitely a need to discuss to discuss this concept more and figure out, can we do anything with it, or is it time to move on from it? Yeah. Now, just a few housekeeping pieces of information. So we've got 4 speakers. Each of us is going to speak from our perspective about native speaker for about 15 minutes. And we're going to save the questions until the end. What I like you to do, if you happen to have any question while someone is speaking, yeah, you're very welcome to write your question in the chat, yeah, if that's what you're most comfortable with. If, however, you want to ask your question or make your point by, opening up your microphone and hopefully also your camera at the end, everyone is also very welcome to do that, okay? I should warn you, if you are going to do that, we are recording, so the question and answer session will be openly available on YouTube. If you are uncomfortable with sharing your name and your likeness, probably you might like to ask your question in the chat instead. Okay. I think that's enough of the introduction. Yeah. I think we better get started. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask our first speaker, Jean-Marc Deval, to speak. Okay, but let me introduce him first. So Jean-Marc is professor of applied linguistics and multilingualism at the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Applied Linguistics at Birkbeck, University of London, where he's also the director of the Center for Multilingual and Multicultural Research. Jean-Marc is a phenomenally productive and creative scholar. The largest part of his work deals with the relationship between emotions and language teaching and learning. But he's also dealt with quite an interesting thing, which is the link between language and psychotherapy, which is quite a, interesting idea. He's written books about emotions in multiple languages with Palgrave, Raising Multilingual Children with Multilingual Matters, and Questionnaires in Second Language Research, co-authored with Zoltán Dornier, as well as more than 100 journal articles and many book chapters. He was in the past editor of the International Journal of Bilingualism and Bilingual Education, and now the editor of the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development. And I should also say that he is a past president of the European Second Language Association, which this year awarded him the Distinguished Scholar Award, which we belatedly also congratulate him for. So, Jean-Marc, you've been one of the strong voices around the concept of native speaker, I think, in the recent years, yeah? I think share us your slides and tell us what have been your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this matter?
Okay. Thank you very much, Christoph, for this nice introduction. I thought that it would be, I changed the title somewhat, although not the topic, because I realized that in the debate about the native speaker, that we have been bitching too much about the use of the term, and you can complain forever about a term that you don't like. If you can't offer anything more positive instead, then the debate is unlikely to move into a more positive direction. So the point I want to make is that, in fact, we can look at positive psychology for an inspiration to move away from the deficit view that is inherent in the use of native and non-native speaker. And so the paper I'm going to present is a short version of a paper I published this year with my friend and colleague Kazuya Saito from University College London, and you see the reference at the bottom of the screen. Now, this is an almost rhetorical question. You probably recognize the pictures of these people. Abba, Gloria, Stefan, first aid kit, Arno Hintjes, he's a Belgian singer, and I would ask you, can you guess what these people have in common? And since it's a rhetorical question, it's hard to start asking people to answer. The answer is obviously that these are singers who sing in a language that they were not born with. They sing in a foreign language. Abba's English was amazingly good. First Aid Kit, two Swedish sisters. Again, they sing in American English that is astounding. Gloria Estefan sings in French, Spanish, Portuguese, English. And Arno Hintjes is a Flemish, well, was a Flemish singer who sang in French and English. And in his French, he had a very, very strong Flemish dialectal accent. And that didn't stop him from being much loved in the Francophone world. So no journalist has ever referred to these singers as non-native singers, because they had their own unique styles, and they were all amazingly appreciated for the quality of their singing and their songs. So the point I want to make is that the words we have can have extremely harmful effects, and that the words we use are not neutral words. And a word like native and non-native speaker is in fact a very loaded term, and I think it should become a taboo word. Now, I understand why researchers and myself also, I mean, we are interested in what people have in common and where they are different, and both are legitimate avenues of research. There is, however, a danger that if you focus too much on one thing, you might develop a blind spot and forget that there might be another perspective. And obviously, this native, non-native dichotomy is an easy one to make. And the underlying assumption is that native is better than non-native, and that one is homogeneous while the other is heterogeneous. And yet, the terms have been criticized since the early, well, in fact, since the 1980s, like that they are too simplistic and problematic, that it shows a monolingual bias, and that it is very strange to define a person, a non-native speaker, by something that the person is not. So why would I define myself as a non-woman or a non-Brit? It's not logical. Or non-murderer. I haven't murdered anyone yet. And the crucial point is that a so-called non-native speaker is automatically also a native speaker of languages. So why would we refer to somebody by, in fact, referring to only half of that person? And there is a pedagogical consequence of this. It's that foreign language learners are told that they should reach the native speaker ideal. And I think that's a source of stress and distress, and that you could compare it to photoshopped, impossibly thin models in fashion magazines. In fact, both learners and teachers have been indoctrinated that they should be indistinguishable from native speakers. And we all know that except for a very, very small minority, this is impossible. So I came across this argument that the native speakerism is in fact a neo-racist ideology, and that it runs in counter to the cherished American value of equality. And Mahmoud pointed out that maybe the fault lies with program administrators in universities who think that students prefer native speakers. And Holiday explained that it's a neo-racist ideology rather than just racist, because race is not in the agenda of the minds of the people concerned, but he refers to a really fascinating paper by Balibar and Wallerstein that talk about neo-racism, which is in fact a way of excluding certain parts of the population, and based here on the language they use. And so Holliday adds that native speakerism is implicit and hidden behind the supposedly neutral and innocent talk of cultural issues. So the problem with the concept of native and non-native speaker is that it's a static, deterministic view of a very complex, dynamic reality, meaning that we are changing, in fact, constantly. I've been in London for 28 years, and you hear straight away that I'm not a British person. So when I'm asked outside London, where are you from? I say, oh, from London. When I'm asked the same question in London, then I say, well, you know, originally I'm from Belgium, and then people say, oh, okay, interesting. So it's not necessarily a hostile question, but it's a constant reminder that I'm not a British person. Now, another thing to take into account is that modern neuroscience doesn't find any differences between first and foreign languages. I mean, they are situated in the same place in the brain, and the L1 can be more affected than the LX with a brain trauma. So the question then is, why are we still using these terms? And it's linked to the argument, well, we have always used them. There is the prescriptivist tradition in teaching and publishing, so it needs to be native-like standard. Language schools use it to promote the quality of their teaching. And the EFL industry, I think, wants to create linguistic insecurity in order to sell more books and to convince more people to sign up for expensive courses. And this is a pretty typical view, you know, if you are shamed by your English, interesting also how the R disappeared there, then you should enroll in the school of Mr. Dan Bolle. So I've introduced a suggestion to talk about first language users rather than native speakers, because it's a value neutral term. It means that you typically have a high level of proficiency in that first language, but it's not inherent in the label, because you could be a first language user, but also a first language attritor. You may not have used that first language for a long time, so you are still a first language user, but you are a minimal user of that language. Also, there is huge variation within the L1 user population, and not all L1 users pass for so-called native speakers, and that's research at the University of Stockholm. And then crucially, a first language user is also typically a foreign language user, and that is a crucial point. So Vivian Cook introduced the term of L2 user instead of non-native speaker, and I think that was a really good suggestion. Especially user rather than speaker, because you can use a language but not speak it. I mean, you can read it or maybe understand it, but you don't necessarily speak it. I mean, also you might sign it but not speak it. But the number two I thought was problematic, especially if you look at people's multiple foreign languages. So I suggested to use LX, where the X stands for any language acquired after the age of 3. Now, researchers have been critical of native speaker, non-native speaker distinction, sometimes use inverted commas to show that they are uneasy with the concept. And I think there is also growing awareness and agreement in the field that we shouldn't expect our foreign language learners to sound like first language users, that we have to shift away from the native speaker norm, and that we should focus more on making our students intelligible rather than trying to stamp out their foreign accent. And so with Thomas Bach and Lourdes Ortega, we published this chapter last year saying that, you know, why the mythical native speaker has mud on its face, that foreign language users and learners shouldn't be stressed and shamed for not sounding like first language users, that in fact, I'm perfectly happy with my foreign accent in English. People understand me, and that the whole aim of using foreign languages, that the dichotomy native, non-native is ideologically, epistemologically, methodologically flawed, and that we should avoid using these words just like racist, sexist, or homophobic slurs, because they contribute to the perpetuation of a pernicious ideology. And I was here really struck by a paper you published, Christophe, on the fact that non-native speakers of English in Thailand earn much less than native speakers, and that this dichotomy often overlaps with race. And my students gasp when I tell them this, that is such a profound injustice. So that in itself is enough to fight this concept of native, non-native speakers. Now, to be a little bit more positive, don't know whether you know about positive psychology. The positive psychologists focused on how normal people live. So rather than focusing on problems, they look at the bright side of life without denying that there are negative aspects of life and problems. And so they focus on topics like flow, hope, courage, well-being, optimism. In fact, all the characteristics, I would say, of good teachers who have to believe that their students are able to progress. So my argument would be that positive psychology has the potential to inform social change, and that we need social change in our field. Also, a really interesting paper by Peter McIntyre, Tammy Gregerson, and Sarah Mercer in 2019, talking about positive psychology and applied linguistics, pointing there that we have to reject the deficit model in learners and teachers, and that we need also more empirical and theoretical plurality in the field. Now, to conclude, in fact, the one point is that we may think that being a first language user is always the privilege, right? And in Thailand, you would earn more than if you were a foreign language user of English. However, it's not always a privilege. And this is a really interesting paper by Lovritz and De Bres. They are researchers at the University of Luxembourg, and they investigated the experience of first language users of English in multilingual European institutions. And they interviewed 4 trainees that had temporary contracts. I think they worked at the European Court of Justice. And they tried to hide the fact that they had English as a first language, because they discovered that when that word gets out, you end up correcting other people's work, proofreading other people's work. So they were saying, oh no, I'm from Malta. And they used all kinds of excuses to hide the fact that English was their first language. So my first conclusion is that we need this awareness of toxic words, that behind these toxic words and ideology is also the myth and the concept of linguistic purity and perfection, which I think is a really dangerous illusion, that the whole myth of the native speaker is pernicious, that I encourage my friends and colleagues to talk about first and foreign language users and avoid these loaded terms. Also to avoid a deficit perspective, not just in their classrooms, but in fact also in their research, that you don't see the learner as a problematic entity who hasn't yet reached a high enough standard, and that LX user EFL teachers don't need to be like linguistic clones of L1 English EFL teachers, but of course they need sufficient skill to be good and effective teachers. I also think it's not possible to neutralize the negative ideological connotation of native, non-native speaker. And I think that we should resolutely reject the argument that because these words have been around forever, we can't possibly remove them. Because I would point to certain racial words and words that refer to sexual orientation that have become taboo because they are no longer considered acceptable. And I think that native, non-native should join that category of words and be relegated to history's soundproof linguistic and conceptual bin. And here are some references, and I'd be happy to answer questions in the chat or at the end of today's presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Thank you for that spectacularly well-timed presentation as well. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I think that the positive psychology angle here is really interesting, right? What can we do to improve things? What else do we have to offer rather than complaining? Yeah, or only complaining. Yes, brilliant. Okay, but I think we move straight on to our next speaker. Our next speaker, which is Talia Isaacs. Talia is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at TESOL at the Center for Applied Linguistics, Institute of Education, University College London. And she is concurrently also Associate Professor of TESOL at the Graduate School of Education, Anaheim University in the US. A big part of Talia's work is about language assessment. If you look at her list of funded projects and publications, you'll see work on both the speaking and writing components of the IELTS test offered by Cambridge, as well as work on the Duolingo English test. A kind of theme that emerges across these that we might hear about today is the role of accents in testing. And she's also published an edited volume with Pavel Trofimovich about Sankan language pronunciation assessment with multilingual matters. Beyond that, she's also worked on the relationship between language and healthcare, especially in relation to the way that people are recruited for medical trials, which is, yet again, a very fascinating perspective. She's also on the editorial board of the journal Language Testing, and previously also for Language Assessment Quarterly. So you definitely have your language testing credentials, Talia. Okay, I think we're eager to hear your perspective on native speaker.
Well, thanks so much, Christoph. Thank you for organizing this symposium. It's obviously on a contested topic, and I'm delighted to be sharing my views, coming at this from a language assessment perspective as well as a sociolinguistic perspective. But these are my own views. So, and you'll see that there are some points on which I agree with Jean-Marc and then others where I don't. So we'll start with Friedrich Nietzsche, obviously a German philosopher who famously wrote, "God is dead," right? No, God is no longer a credible source of absolute moral principles. About 100 years later, Canadian lexicographer Thomas Pikeday wrote, "The native speaker is dead." And you can see sort of the link. Well, it seems to me that we're still, I mean, that particular book was sort of a Socratic dialogue with linguists of the day, where they were discussing the role of the native speaker. And I mean, I think just on the basis of having so many people interested in this topic, we can say that the native speaker is still alive and well well we're talking about it, and should it be is another question. And I think certainly Jean-Marc's given his views on that, and hopefully mine will be clear by the end of this presentation. So today I'll be basing my talk on some work that I did in concert with Heath Rose, published recently in TESOL Quarterly, that I'm very pleased finally saw the light of day, because we were worried that this would never get published. With people not agreeing with our views, it was very difficult to get this into a journal. So I'll be touching on standards, which are talked about a lot in language assessment. I'll be talking about assessment standards, won't have much time to go into standard language. I'll talk about some double standards in our field, and then also some research recommendations if there's time. But I'll start off with this question of what is an appropriate standard. We always go to sort of a definition of what is a standard. I just want to say here that standards, as Glenn Fulcher points out, are something that are endemic in human societies, that represent some form of utopian vision. And so you get this from the time of the ancient Greeks, where there was talk of different classes of people. You can think of it as sort of Olympic gold medals, gold, silver, and brass or iron classes of people. And if you indulged in things, that were not looked upon, and highly regarded, then you would potentially be removed from high office due to not meeting the standards. So standards are something that are fairly universal in human societies. And in language testing, we can think of standards in reference to the criterion referenced movement in language testing, where instead of comparing students to one another in terms of how they're performing, you look at some kind of predefined standard. And in fact, the term standards was originally synonymous with criterion. So if you are interested in this, do look at some literature on criterion reference language testing. And standards abound. I'll just flip to the next slide here because I've messed up the order. So in England, where I live, there's this Office for Standards in Education that talk about sort of schools and that evaluate them and may have some improvement plans, for example, for schools that seem to be underperforming. And you can see that in this report for primary school standards is written about a lot. You might have talk of children falling behind. So I guess I'd like you to think of an example of standards and standards in assessment that is talked about a lot in all sorts of different societies. Of course, in the educational assessment and psychometric field, there are different standards for educational and psychological testing put forward by 3 American associations. And this is very much the statistical American tradition of educational measurement, where they publish a book or an edition every year, these standards, which are effectively the gold standard of how to talk about things like validity. This really guides testing practice, interfaces with ethics and language testing. But so standards are really out there, and they are talked about a lot in assessment, including in language assessment. And this is just a couple. Barry O'Sullivan has some YouTube hits talking about standards, and I've mentioned Glenn Fulcher's book here. And I think there is some agreement in that the term is subject to different interpretations and there are different understandings of what should constitute the standards. But I don't think that there are people who are really advocating supplanting the standards. There needs to be some standard. The question is just what that standard should be, native speaker or something else. This extends also to standard language. And it can be difficult because in defining what the standard should be, often we think about what variety of language should be the standard. So this can be difficult to define even in inner circle countries in the context of English. So for example, received pronunciation is not spoken, and that is a standard in prestige variety in the UK, and that is not spoken by very many speakers at all. It's quite an elite variety of English, and that has been referred to as Queen's English. But actually, there was an Australian research team that looked at Queen Elizabeth, who's recently obviously passed away, they did an acoustic analysis of her vowels in archived Christmas messaging. I think vowels, it might have also been consonants, but to look at her speech. And they concluded that even the Queen no longer speaks Queen's English. And so the standard language is sometimes referred to as Queen's English, that the Queen's English some decades ago indeed is different than the Queen's English was shortly before she died, that even, that it's difficult to, even in that case, to define sort of standard language. And in the United States, there's sort of, sometimes you define standard language in terms of, and general American in terms of where it's not spoken. There are definitions that also talk about the media, but it's very difficult to localize, to identify the exact locus of standard language. And in fact, the General Atlas of North American English points to 3 different sort of varieties that constitute sort of general American, including Canadian English, which some people, due to political differences between Canada and the United States, might not consider to be, general American. But so this just goes to show that standard language can be difficult to define, even in contexts that are supposedly straightforward. And then in other contexts, there can be tensions, of course, between local varieties and global varieties. Which standard should be incorporated? Should it be American English? Should it be British English? Should it be the local variety or some other form? And then, of course, thinking about what should be the standard in domains where mastery is often unattainable. And I'll be talking about that in the next few slides. Jean-Marc alluded to some of this, that in pronunciation research, there has been a tension between the nativeness principle what should be the appropriate goal of instruction and assessment? Should it be sounding like a native speaker? Is that not setting up our students for failure if that's not something that is realistic? And is it needed in society? Do we need to sound like native speakers to cope in a workplace setting and perform well in academic settings, integrate into society? Probably not. So that really most applied linguists are putting forward that with limited instructional time in a classroom setting, that we should really be promoting intelligibility first and foremost, ensuring that people are readily understandable to the listener. So that's where the most emphasis should be, on focusing on features of language that have the potential to make us more or less easily understandable to people we're speaking with. I'm going to shift now to speaking scales. This is a little image from Heathrow Airport about how positive your airport security experience was. But the interest from me here is looking at second language speaking scales and to see whether there is reference to the native speaker at the top end of the scale. In other words, what should be the appropriate standard? And for something, at a top level of a scale, I think this scale may have changed, the ILR speaking scale here, but you can see from this descriptor that many native speakers would not meet the top level of the scale. You have to be articulate, you need to know about cultural standards in the particular country, you need to speak a non-stigmatized variety, it needs to be well accepted by educated native speakers, and so on and so forth. So many native speakers, I think, wouldn't achieve that standard, maybe not realistic at the top level of the scale. You see in IELTS that there's reference to, in the one of the subscales in the public version, naturally and appropriately, which some of Luke Harding's work on a different scale has suggested kind of indirectly sort of implies native speaker, but then they actually do refer explicitly to native speaker speech. So at the top level of scale, there is reference to the native speaker, which might, again, not be appropriate. You get some automated systems as well, like this is the Pearson Pearson academic test, and where there's reference to you know, some intelligibility and looking at the proportion of words that the machine algorithm has accurately identified, but then the top level of the scale is reported as native-like. So within this methodology of developing the algorithm as well, and also how it seems to be operationalized, it seems that what is being measured is not only intelligibility, but also deviations from what human listeners consider to be native speaker norms. Okay, and then of course, sometimes you have media stories about even native speakers don't do well on tests like that. You know, IELTS is used sometimes by native speakers, and you know, if you're not familiar with the test, you might not get the top level. And then of course, sometimes computer algorithms can't understand even native varieties of English, which you know, tend to be publicized. The CFR has done an overall good job of revising and coming up with an intelligibility based approach here, and not referring to native speaker standards in this scale. And a lot of my research has been driven by this notion of needing to have a scale where successful non-native speakers, this is in the teacher's quote, need to be at the top end of the scale, so that you know, I think in some scales that's not the case. That if there are traces of an L1 accent, the implication is that you shouldn't be at the top level of the scale, whereas that's not realistic. We all have accents, and lots of colleagues of mine working in higher education settings who are perfectly proficient may have traces of an L1 accent and should still be at the top level of the scale. And so in scales that we've developed, this was one for pedagogical purposes, we've explicitly said that sounding native-like is not necessary at the top level of the scale, so that the standard, we've tried to describe the speech in terms of characteristics of the speech without resorting to a native-like standard, but we needed to state explicitly that you don't need to be native-like sounding to achieve the highest level of the scale. There is some work, I'll just touch on this very briefly, and this is the flip side of the coin, thinking about listening, listening in language testing, listening prompts, and who should be speaking those accents. And most tests now look at either just one native speaker or inner circle variety, but I think there is a goodwill to move towards having different L2 accents represented in listening comprehension tests. This would certainly promote positive washback effects in the classroom, so maybe encouraging listening to different varieties of a language like English, but not only, it could be other target languages. Of course, we know that familiarity effects are something that can affect item difficulty. So that is something that has been a deterrent in incorporating this, but maybe there will be some movement in the future toward tailor listening tests. Luke Harding's done some work on this, and Oh Kim Kang and others. I'll jump now to what qualifies as a native speaker, that sometimes there's a mismatch between what individuals think, teachers, and what other people, what they perceive in terms of nativeness. And there are different sort of lists of, you know, what it means to be a native speaker. In this one, you can see that the only one that guarantees native speakerdom is being monolingual. Someone who knows no other language. Alan Davis, who's been influential in language testing, says that the distinction really between native and sort of a highly proficient speaker of the target language is moot. It's not a productive distinction. He instead talks about you know, everybody being able to access standard language through education as being something that we should be doing instead, but it's not always clear which variety should be propped up as standard language, as I mentioned briefly in a previous slide. So I think that is problematic, and I don't think that everyone will have universal access necessarily to standard language through education, and certainly in systems where there are a lot of disparities, that might be quite problematic and a big assumption. There's been some work in language testing drawing on a multi-competence perspective, that we shouldn't, you know, we should be looking at speakers of multiple languages who are highly proficient at the top level of scales, for example, rather than monolingual native speakers. And I think this has kind of been embraced a little bit. Certainly, you know, in high stakes texts like IELTS, You know, they've been clear to say that the test does not discriminate between native and non-native speakers in terms of who the examiners will be. So if you want to be an accredited IELTS examiner, you know, you don't need to be a native speaker. You do need to achieve the top level of the scale. The question is who would have to take IELTS to prove English language proficiency. But I think that overall, you know, even though it's not talked about a lot in language testing, multi-competence, this is something that is being done. Jean-Marc talks about, and there's been a lot of talk about, you know, why the term native speaker is problematic, and I subscribe to some of that. But I don't think that the term user is a good alternative, and here is why. I mean, if you go to a corpus, you see that actually you get a lot of hits for drug user, and the other reason is that the term user is a polysemous word. It has multiple meanings, and this isn't just native speaker intuition. If you go to a dictionary, you will see that a secondary meaning is someone who takes advantage of someone else, somebody who exploits someone else. I don't think that this is a neutral term. It's one that has a very negative connotation. It is not the right substitute for native speaker if we wanted to do that. You know, we need to come up with a better term, I think. I like L1 and L2 much more than user, which I really don't like that term at all for those reasons. There's been some work on supplanting the native speaker standard. This was early work by Jennifer Jenkins some time ago now, where she talked about coming up with sort of a pronunciation curriculum where you'd be promoting intelligibility and coming up with core features intended that could be used as a substitute for a native speaker standard. And I think that the principle of this is okay, but there's not enough research on this to be able to use it in assessment settings. I think, you know, it just really is not, I mean, I think, again, you know, there could be some movement to do this, but it's not fit for prime time and not ready to be adopted as a standard for assessment. It needs much, much more research. I would say, too, that there has been some work in language testing on English lingua franca perspectives. Luke Harding gives a great YouTube talk on that, and has done some work with McNamara on this. And I agree with a lot of the points made about this, and that's not simply restricted to the lingua franca core. It goes far beyond that. So I don't have time to get into that, but I'd encourage you to look at that. Constance Leung and Jenny Jenkins have done some work on language testing and you know, ELF perspectives as well. So do look at that. In terms of sort of labels, yes, sometimes people tell you, please don't use the term non-native. We want you to use another term. You can see that the editors have said we don't completely agree, or we may not completely agree with people who object to the label. The comparative fallacy that it reinforces, we recognize that it's a polarizing term. But then we did that in an article led by a student that went to TESOL Quarterly and went up for peer review. And in that one, the reviewer, we used the term user, I think, here, even though I just like the term, as I said. The reviewer said, I am a non-native speaker of English. So they themselves identified as a non-native speaker of English. And I do find repetitive reference to these other terms highly confusing. And I think that, and then suggest reincorporating the terms native and non-native speaker. The editor didn't completely agree and left it to the author's discretion about what to do about this. This just goes to show that I don't think that there is universal consensus on use of these terms. I think that some people, and sometimes in communicating, for example, if we were to communicate to the general public, the term native, non-native, and I agree that they are very flawed, and there's a lot of baggage and for reasons that Jean-Marc said, but sometimes those are the most transparent terms, and I don't think that we currently have an alternative, and I certainly don't think user is a good alternative. So we might need to go back to the drawing board. It's interesting to note that journals have started to ban the term native speaker and non-native speaker. I mean, if you look at a phonetics conference, you'll see that these terms are used very often uncritically, and I think it's important to dialogue with them so that they understand that in different fields these notions are problematic. But I don't necessarily think that there should be censorship, although I do understand that they can be offensive. I'm wrapping up now here. You know, the British Association for Applied Linguistics has had a mailing list, and you know, almost a decade ago now, there was an advertisement at a Belgian university that talked about near native or native proficiency needing for a teaching assistant. And there was an outcry. I mean, people end up being quite demonized about use of that term, you know, saying that, this was Jennifer Jenkins saying, I thought BAL members had agreed not to post any more job adverts asking for native English. So they banned the term native speaker. So I'm assuming that the person used the term native you know, without realizing, and there was an outcry. This happened sort of on more than one occasion. But what I think is scandalous here is that Jennifer Jenkins uses the term N-word and sort of equates that with the native speaker. And she actually published that in her book. I don't know if you're familiar with American English, but this is one of the most, the N-word is one of the most incendiary terms. You know, it's basically a euphemism for, you know, a racist term that's among the most offensive in American English. I think that, and she did, and you know, this is kind of done on a high horse of political correctness, which I think is very hypocritical, frankly, and unprofessional. And you know, it's comparing sort of native speakerism with all of the flaws that it has to the suffering and degradation of African Americans, which I think you know, is disparaging and trivializes victims of racism. I just don't think that's acceptable. And I think that there has been a lot of hostility and, as I said, demonizing people who may unassumedly use the term. So I think that there needs to be some call for civility. We need to understand that there are different traditions within applied linguistics and indeed linguistics, purely, you know, experimental linguistics, that there should be a place for all traditions within this broad tent. We don't need to agree, but I think there should be a baseline of respect. I think that we should accept that native speaker benchmarks will continue to persist in accuracy-focused research. There's a lot of work, for example, on accent. I think that that work, you know, has some value. You know, it's only one of several traditions, but I think, again, we can agree to disagree, but I think that, you know, that those benchmarks will persist. And, you know, I also would think that it would be positive to move to some kind of way of supplanting the native speaker standard, but we're not there yet. There really isn't an alternative codifiable global standard. I've said why I think the terms are problematic. The replacement term for native, non-native. I mean, it would be great if we could, if everybody in the world understood CEFR levels, and we could just put that into an advert about what level was required, but not everybody understands that. So I think, you know, the definitional problem remains. I think there needs to be a much more careful operationalization of native speakers in research reporting. You know, really, this is a group that is very, you know, it's often painted as being homogeneous, but in fact, it's not a monolith. Researchers should be careful in how they define native speaker for recruitment purposes, if they're including native speakers. Some traditions, of course, do compare native and non-native, not all, and sometimes that is not appropriate, but if they do, they should take, you know, care to, you know, think about how they're operationalizing the construct of native speaker and to describe them, you know, appropriately in research reporting, but also thinking about whether native speaker controls and norms are justified, and if that is a good, you know, and fair comparison, because sometimes it might not be, and it might not be appropriate to use native speaker controls. For example, if they're going to exhibit ceiling performance anyway, you know, why include native speakers? Why not make a comparison with highly proficient speakers of a language? So I think there needs to be more careful thought and research about you know, how we frame these things, but I don't think, however, whatever our stance on this, and as I showed in the quote from the reviewer, there's some quote, non-native speakers who identify them, who use the term themselves and who identify with that term. Others, of course, have very different views and consider it a very offensive term. But I think there does need to be some appeal for decency. We do need to have a dialogue that is civil, and I hope that will be the case in this symposium. I'm sure that it will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talia. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, certainly food for discussion, I think. Yeah. Okay, but let's move on to our third speaker now. Yeah. Our third speaker is Li-Jin Choi, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English Education at Songkla University in the Republic of Korea. Li-Jin holds a PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the US. She does research which focuses on Korean English bilinguals, language acquisition, language use, and also identity. And she also does work which is quite socially oriented. So she's linking these phenomena to broader concepts like language ideology, looking at media discourse, things like that. And I think certainly from a Thai perspective, I think we have a lot of experiences to share. I think a lot of Li-Jin's work is sort of framed by a kind of English fever, you know, the pressure for learning and teaching English, certainly something that, you know, I can connect with from a Thai perspective. She's published work in very prestigious journals, including Language in Education, Multilingua, Language in Society, Journal of Language Identity and Education, and a few others as well. Li-Jin Choi, share your slides and regale us with your thoughts, please.
Okay, thanks, Christopher, for a nice introduction. And can everybody see the PowerPoint right now on your screen? Okay, very good. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone to be here. I know that for some of you, it's around dinner time, and for some of you, it's very early morning. So I really want to appreciate every single one of you to take time and be here with us so that we can talk about how to unpack this powerful yet very essential ideology of native speakerism. The previous two presentations gave us an in-depth understanding of how to better situate the discourse of native speakerism in a more, I would say, macro discursive level. And my presentation today is going to focusing on a more micro level. So I'm going to talk about how this prominent ideology of native speakerism actually has affected and shaped the way that we as a language user and language educator understand the role of language, language teaching and learning, and also importantly, language learner and teacher identities as well. So I would like to start my presentation by sharing a little bit about myself. Not because I'm an interesting person. Believe me, I'm one of the most boring professors who just love to spend time by myself in my office. But nonetheless, I decided to share a little bit of myself because I think it will invite you to think more about where this issue is coming from and why it is important to talk about it today together. And the other thing is, I think and I hope listening to my story will make you to think about your own experiences of learning and using an additional language. I'm pretty sure all of you at some point of your life have used or learned a foreign language. And when you look closely onto those experiences, you might be able to make a connection between yourself and some of the issues that we are talking about today, such as power relation, like language ideologies, labeling, marginalization, idealization, identity negotiation. These are some of the issues I feel that everyone have an experience with. And that's one of the reasons I would like to share small stories about me. Okay, so little about me. As probably most of you noticed, I speak Korean as my first language, and I started to learn English when I was 12 as a foreign language. And I consider myself as a lifelong English language learner and user. I need to come up with a better term rather than a user, but I was not prepared for today's talk, so I'm going to use the term user. But anyhow, I really enjoy using and learning English. Across the different time span and across time spaces, I have been considered and viewed differently as an English language user and learner. Some of the times I was viewed as a Korean English language learner and user. Other times I was labeled as an international student who use English as a non-native speaker and whose English in general has a limitation. And another setting, I was labeled as a non-native graduate assistant whose English needs to be constantly monitored by the department in order to ensure the quality of education. And in other settings, generally simply, I was viewed as an accented English speaker. And as you see, across the different settings and different language ideologies, my identity and my positionality as a language learner, English language user and learner, have been shaped and understood differently. And another fact about me is that I graduated from the Teachers College and I've been working as an English teacher. And I have taught various set of the students, including so-called as a pure Korean students who learn English as a foreign language, and heritage language learners and students coming from the multilingual background, both in South Korea and in the States. And again, depending on the educational setting and depending on the body of the students, my identity as an English language teacher had been framed and understood differently as well. So in South Korea, mostly I was viewed and called as a Korean English language teacher, or sometimes a local English teacher. And according to some of the government documentation, I was viewed as a non-native English teacher. And in other education setting, I was viewed as EFL teacher, bilingual teacher, multilingual teacher. And one particular setting, I was not recognized as an English language teacher because I don't use English as a first language. So again, depending on the discursive communities and the language dynamics and ideology that have been embedded into that particular discursive community, my positionality and identity options tend to be allowed and limited and need to be negotiated. And I'm pretty sure my experience is going to be different from yours. But when you're thinking about bits and pieces of your own experience of learning and using an additional language, you might come up with a moment or two where a certain identity was assigned to you, or your language proficiency was defined as something based on the local language dynamics. And this issue is very relevant to what we are talking about, the issue of native speakerism. And the other thing you might have noticed from my own story is about when I listing the different labels and categorization that have been assigned to me, there's the concept of nativeness being used a lot, like non-native teacher or native speakers and things like that. The thing is that when you're thinking about the label, the native and non-native, it seems to be really clear and really accurately portraying the group of people and their language proficiency. But when you pay a closer attention to that and more critically looking at that, the concepts itself are really abstract. So for example, when we are describing a certain individual as they're using the X language as a native language, what does that mean? Meaning can be very abstract, and it's not really accurately portraying one's language proficiency. So for example, when you're thinking about like immersion bilingual who are growing up with the two languages and simultaneously using and acquiring the two languages, which language are you going to be associated with the nativeness? It's pretty hard to make a definition, like clear definition. A language is going to be native and the other one is going to be a non-native variety. And same thing goes for the students coming from the multilingual repertoire. A lot of time, it's pretty hard to pinpoint onto the one language variety and saying that, okay, you're native to this language. So this can be one of the reasons we're using the term native and non-native labeling quite a lot because it's easy and very simple and looking pretty clear. But when you're looking into the in-depth level, it's very like vague and messy in the setting. So that's one of the reasons that we need to talk about it when it comes to the students, language learners, and also language teachers' identities. So going back to the native speakerism, when you're looking at the slide, these are some of the major characteristics relevant to the native speakerism. We're going to go over it really quickly. So the first that goes on, native speakerist ideologies refers to a pervasive ideology within ELT, not only about ELT, but when you're looking across the different foreign language teaching and learning contexts, this concept exists and has a certain power. And it characterized by the belief that native speaker represent a Western culture and an authentic English speaker. So basically what it means is that the native speaker ideologies tends to portray a group, so-called as a native speaker, as someone who has an authentic cultural and linguistic knowledge relevant to the target language. So there's a lot of idealization that are going on. That's one of the reasons when you're moving on to the second dot, this ideological discourse prioritize the acquisition of native-like English as an ultimate goal of English education, true for any other languages. Because there's an idealization going on about the native speaker, we tend to idealize not only the speakerhood, but their language proficiency. So when it comes to the language learner's perspective, your goal, that your ultimate goal to become a successful language learner is gonna be reach up to the near-like native level, even though I'm not sure what that means. But that's the goal that's set by the native speaker list ideology. And the other interesting thing about the native speaker ideology is that it not only presents the English speaker, native English speaker as an ideal model, but also posit the native speaker as an ideal teacher too. Because when you're idealizing the native speaker as someone with the authentic cultural and linguistic knowledge, it kind of marginalizing the non-native counterpart as less qualified with not enough cultural and linguistic knowledge of the target language. So marginalization and idealization kind of goes together. And that's how the non-native teachers tend to be portrayed as less qualified teacher according to the native speaker list ideology. So I've been talking about native speaker list ideology quite a lot to my colleagues and to my students. I'm working in the Teachers College, so mostly I'm teaching the pre-service teachers. And a lot of them actually buy the concept and understand the concept. But some of the students always raise their concerns and saying that I understand that native speakerism is really bad. But when you're thinking about it, it's just a vague and very abstract belief that are circulating in the society, and it doesn't really do any harm on the individual. I'm pretty sure none of you in the audience would raise the same question, but I'm a little bit concerned about the criticism, so I'm going to use the case of South Korea to illustrate how this particular ideology can have a real impact and how it can be physically and visualized in a certain setting. So when you're looking at the South Korea, like many other EFL countries around South Korea, the South Korean government has been strongly promote the importance of English education. So starting from the 4th national curriculum, it kind of aims to help students acquiring living English. That's a literal translation of 생활영어 in Korean. So they elaborated on saying that what they mean by acquiring living English is making sure that students are exposed to the authentic language input and output. And also by doing so, students can achieve a near native-like or native-like communicative competence. So that's going to be the goal that are setting for the public English education system. And as one of the efforts to help the students to achieve these goals, the South Korean government initiated 2 different programs, and EPIC and TALK are the 2 major programs led by the government, where the government actively recruit the so-called as a native speaking teachers and allocate them in the public education system, starting from the elementary school and leading on to the high school. And one of the purposes that they describe in the policy level is that by doing so, we as a government can help South Korean students and teachers alike better their authentic English language abilities, especially the communicative ability. And at the same time, they can get a creative idea in terms of the teaching methodology too. And obviously, when you're thinking about these policies and programs and implementation, it highly internalized the idea of native speakerism, and a lot of scholars actually criticize on that. And one of the interesting thing about this particular policy and implementation is that when you're thinking about yourself from the student's perspective, all of a sudden in your English class, there are going to be 2 different types of the English teacher you're getting. One is a native English teacher, and the other one is a non-native local Korean English teachers. And having those 2 bodies of the teachers present in the same class will give the students a message saying that, okay, the ultimate purpose of learning an English for me is going to be achieving and acquiring native-like proficiency. But when I'm looking at my Korean students, obviously he or she failed to do so. That's why I'm having a native speaker teacher in my class. So this gives the idea that no matter how hard I'm trying in my English acquisition, I'm not going to be able to acquire the native-like competency at all. So when you're looking at some of the recent studies, Korean students and Koreans in general started to believe that English especially so-called as a native like English proficiency, is not something that they can achieve within South Korea. So they started to have very much frustration, and they never be able to envision themselves to become a successful English language learner within the domestic setting. So we started to experience the popularity of early study abroad, English medium, kindergarten, in order to achieve this so-called as the attainable goal of becoming a native like English speaker. And obviously, it's not just a state in South Korea. When you're looking around the different EFL countries, it's the same like frustration shared by the students. Students seemingly receive the goal that they need to become like a native speaker, but they are very much frustrated because no matter how hard you're trying, it's not something that's attainable for them. It's seemingly like that. So there's a lot of frustration and negative emotions arise from the students. And obviously, as we can assume, it kind of limits the students' identity options as being a successful and good language learner. And this is some of the interview data comes from July 2015 interview. And it's kind of interesting that this particular interview was done by the advanced English language learner of language learner. So she was very proficient in English, but still you can see the frustration, and there was a little bit of anxiousness that are going on. And obviously the native speaker has a real impact onto the students and language users' identity, as you can see in this interview data. And going on to the teachers, obviously teachers' identities are questioned a lot under the native speakerism, because they're the ones who are often positioned and portrayed as less qualified and unskilled compared to the native counterpart. And a lot of struggles being reported by many different researchers. And these are some of the interview data coming from other research as well. And as you can see, that teachers are struggling because their previously acquired identity as a successful English language teacher clashed a lot with the native speakerism. They are simply positioned as unskilled, unqualified, accented English teachers, sometimes no English teacher at all. And this is some of the real impact that are going on to the professional identity of the so-called as a non-native teachers. And going back to the native speakerism, one thing I want to highlight is that, as some of you actually pointed out, one of the dangers that lies into the native speakerist ideology, especially in EFL country, is about the racial linguistic representation of the ideal native speaker body. So this is the EPIC, the recruitment homepage. It's the first front page of that homepage. And as you can see, we see a particularly selective body of the particular racialized body of the ideal L2, ideal not native teacher. And it's not just about this website. I've been doing a little bit of research on the regional report on these native teachers in South Korea. And you can see that there's a little bit of diversity, but it seems like there's a particular portrayal of the racialized body that's been idealized as a native teacher in South Korea. And when you're looking at the other spaces as well, there's a little bit of diversity here and there, but it's quite obvious that the concept of whiteness is intertwined with the concept of nativeness in EFL countries. And I think it can potentially deliver a very dangerous message to EFL students, especially when you're thinking about EFL students. They're not physically or it's more like a physically exposed to the different diversities beyond the English classroom setting. So that's one of the reasons we need to be a little bit more cautious. What's going to be the representation we are giving to our students as an ideal native speaker model? So beyond the native speaker, it's a very hard question. So I thought about it a lot. And one of the things we need to bear in mind is that we need to question this idealization of native speaker and native-like English proficiency. Especially when it comes to the educational setting. Even as an educator, I have witnessed that many of the educators do not really question whether it's going to be attainable, whether it's going to be reasonable, or whether it's something that students want, to set the goal of the English language learning as the acquisition of native like English language proficiency. And some of my research demonstrating that when it comes to the students themselves, they do not want to become like a native speaker. They do not want to sound like a native speaker because that's not what they're interested in. And that's not what they're invested in when it comes to English language education. So meaning that rather than just accepting the imposed ideology as it is, we need to start to making a critical question whether it's something that students actually need. And we need to think about more of the attainable and more realistic goals for our students. And the other thing is about native speakerism is that oftentimes in EFL countries, as many of others were pointed out, there's an idealization of native speakerism and racial linguistic ideologies kind of intertwined together. And some of the works are pointing to the fact that whiteness is the concept that's hidden into the native speakerist ideology as well. And that's one of the concepts I think we need to raise a serious question, especially I'm a little bit concerned about these days because of the COVID-19, we started to pay attention to the importance of AI and language technology. And when I'm looking at some of the, in South Korea, chatbot is really popular being used in a public education setting. But when you're thinking about those language technologies, a lot of time, one variety of English is introduced as a standard and students need to follow the pronunciation given by the application. And a lot of time it kind of reinforced the idea of native speakerism, but it's the technology very new. So it seems like not many people have a question about the danger behind the technology. And this is something I think we need to also work on as a future research agenda.
Okay, thank you, Li Jin. That was very interesting. Yeah, I think that you pointed out, I think, to a really important part of this, which is this double bind that native speakerism places in the mind of learners, particularly. A demand which seems, seems unavoidable, but which is so, which is in the end idealized to the extent that it is unreachable. So it's sort of pushing you towards that, but also stopping you from getting to it. Yeah, that's a really important point. Yes. Okay. I'm going to continue more or less from where everyone else has left off and talk about the issue of access in the teaching profession. So the question of who gets to become a teacher in what place and the discourse that there is around that. And I'm going to talk about this on the basis of research I've been doing in Thailand over the last 3 to 4 years, starting with that article that Jean-Marc already mentioned in his paper, in his presentation, and now continuing on to a couple of later bits of work as well. Okay, one thing that I wanted to point out, okay, is a couple of accepted truths at the beginning, okay? Number one, couple of accepted truths. Well, the first truth is that there is an assumed link in a lot of, let's say, folk discourse around the idea of native speaker, that there is a link between the nativeness of a teacher and the achievement of students, right? When you actually look at the literature, there isn't really much to back that up. There's a recent article, a review article in the journal Language Teaching from Jurta and Calvetere, which you can have a look at, which basically highlights this, that, this is a bit of a sort of misconnect. Obviously, why is because this is very difficult to prove. There are so many factors around, but likely also because we're over idealizing this nativeness. Obviously, what is also being generalized across the world in this native speaker, through this native speaker ideology, is a very specific concept of language and what it means to belong to a particular language and to own a particular language. Someone like Rohani Tupas, who I think is in the audience, would talk about this as rooted in colonial thinking, right? That there is a very specific kind of belonging. Sorry, Li Wang, I'm not sharing the slides, okay? Because I think that will cause another disaster. So I'm going to avoid doing that. Another point that I really needs to be made here, and I think this is goes to the point of what does native speaker, what can we actually use this term? Well, if we use the term, one of the problems is that what are you a native speaker of? If we think about what we value in language teaching and also language assessment, right? We value a very specific segment of any language, right? We tend to value standard language, what people might call academic language, right? The language of literacy, right? With all that fancy correct grammar, the commas in all the right places, that sort of thing, right? Which of course no one is a native speaker of, right? No one acquires written standard language at 2 and 3 years of age. We all acquire that through lifelong learning, and some people become particularly good at doing that, and some never do. Some probably never need to write an academic article. Now, the context of the work that I've been doing in Thailand about the teaching profession is the kind of inequality that Jean-Marc already mentioned, where we have jobs that are advertised at a very comfortable upper middle class level for native speaker only, and we have jobs which are advertised at almost 50% of that same salary for non-native speaker. I've got a couple of ads here that I'm not going to be able to show you, but I can send you the slides after, where it's even specified non-native European, which is a kind of in-between category, and non-native Asian, which is really sort of at the very bottom of the scale, close to half of what the proper native speaker in quotation mark would command. Now, beyond that, of course, we've got to keep in mind that there are also some workplaces and even countries where the teaching profession is completely inaccessible for people who don't hold a passport of one of those 5 magical countries. Yeah, if we're talking about English teachers here, yeah, in Asia predominantly, that's what we're talking about. Certainly, I believe this was until recently the case in South Korea. Certainly, I believe it was also the case in Japan. In Thailand, this was never the case. So what we have is more of an unequal distribution, but in a very varied market. In this market, we often see also that nativeness often trumps qualification. And in the most dramatic sense, which is that there are people, there are so-called non-native speakers who are qualified to teach in English medium programs at primary, secondary, even in tertiary education, which means that aside from being good at English, they also have knowledge of a particular other academic field, which command lower salaries because their passport doesn't have the right letters on it. So obviously this tells us that, when we're talking about passports, and this is going to what Li Jin already pointed out, right? We're talking about, in reality, what a person looks like, right? Does a person look like someone like this or someone like that? In the research that Jean-Marc mentioned before, which is MA thesis by Luc Comprendio originally, which we then developed into an article, that was incredibly clearly borne out when Luc asked his participants, which were Thai students in the Thai students, teachers, and parents at schools around our region, who is a native speaker? Well, most of them said something on the lines of, well, these are people who have white skin, blonde hair. That was kind of the one that was sort of pointed out, right? And non-native speaker was, well, they look like us. So mainly they are Asians. That was very clearly pointed out. And in other cases, the research that I've done has looked at also job advertising online and the discourse around that. And there you also find things like, advertisements which say, native or non-native is okay, but non-native has to be European or South African, right? Which is a very veiled way of saying, well, we want a white person, right? In some dramatic cases, you will find even an advertisement saying a white teacher wanted, which doesn't generally happen. There seems to be a little bit of sort of self-control there, but that does also show up. And why? What is this connected to? Well, this work that I've done in Thailand has really highlighted that this is connected to also local political economic relations, to political economic inequalities within the Thai context, and also I'm sure many others, right? If studying with a white guy, to put it really, really out there, is an elite privilege. It's something that is worth more. That's why also the white guy is worth more. That's why the white guy commands the higher salary, because they are a more precious commodity on the market. Which, of course, right, and going back to Jean-Marc made this point about how being a native speaker is not always an advantage. This is a very dehumanizing, it is a privileging position, of course, but it's also a kind of dehumanizing position at the same time, that you are basically, like a statue with some kind of magic attached to it, but without too much substance to offer. So in this research that Luke did, there was a lot of students and especially parents talking about giving off this feeling of missing out. My daughter lost in a speech competition because her accent wasn't good enough because she didn't get to study with a native speaker. My school doesn't get to hire native speaker teachers because we don't have enough money. Should say that those upper class salaries, upper middle class salaries, and really proper elite salaries that one finds, they are very often in Thailand beyond the range of what, for example, government schools can offer. They are really only available in private education. So we're talking about here as native speaker in a kind of local inequality as well. We're talking obviously here about a geopolitical issue, right? Around, who is the owner of English and that kind of thing, but we're also talking about local inequalities. Having said that, there is some hope for humanity and some hope for the kind of positive psychology that Jean-Marc was mentioning. In that research that Luke did, what actually came out was the students, the English learners who were high school students at the time, they saw, they idealized their native speaker teachers, but they also felt a great distance to them. What they felt was, okay, the sort of, for example, Filipino teachers, they're someone that we can identify with. They're someone that we can actually say, okay, this person is like me. That was a much sort of the sense of, we share a common identity, we share common culture, that sort of thing. Similarly, in another study that's been published a bit more recently, we also found when we interviewed teachers, the Asian teachers and also African teachers working in Thailand, for example, are very happy with their relationship with learners, in particular. They see themselves as able to overcome that objectification in this non-native speaker label. They see themselves as sort of being able to make that connection. Another thing that, another bit of research that I've done is looking at the debates, online debates around the concept of native speaker I looked at a Facebook group where jobs for teaching in Thailand are advertised. And I looked at basically the discussion in the comments. And there, what you found was obviously a lot of these kind of ads saying native speaker or European, right? Native speaker or South African, which sort of blatantly seemed to say white. And the good news there was that was being consistently called out. People were saying, saying, oh, okay, so what you mean is white people need only apply, right? And there was then a lot of discourse around that, a lot of pushback. There was a lot of humor in the groups around this, sort of people putting up memes saying like, oh, you want just white people, right? Who cares if they've worked with kids before? So there was a lot of grassroots resistance. And the hope here is that at some point, the administrator of this group decided, well, enough is enough. And he actually got his mind converted, let's say, by some activists, and decided, okay, we're not going to allow these kind of native speaker or European, these kind of labels anymore. And this person has actually in this group been policing this recently quite consistently. And that's certainly hope that there is a bit of hope to reframe this whole issue, right? To move beyond this simple kind of dichotomy, and especially these very racialized kind of representations. So let's say on the sort of closing note here, what do we do? Well, as I said, this definitely shows that there is potential to reframe, but there is a need for more social dialogue. At present, I get the sense that, for example, in Thailand, parents are often used as an alibi by advertisers, saying that, okay, we need to advertise in this way that, for example, Legion showed, right? Our school has, these white guys in the classroom teaching kids, right? And a lot of time that is justified, well, that's what the parents want. When you actually interview the parents, as Luke did in his research, they will tell you, well, we're also a bit concerned, like, are these guys that we get, are these proper teachers, or were they, I think there was a great quote in his thesis, were they just selling vegetables before they came to work in Thailand as teachers, right? So there is a kind of space there to make a move. The problem is getting beyond this connection to business, to basically branding, right? To marketing, for example, international schools, English medium programs as international white taught. That is where there is a big fight to be done. Since the others have talked about what they think about, have mentioned, should we move beyond the native speaker, the concept or the term? Here, I got to say, I'm also a bit torn. I like, on the one hand, I like the idea of L1, LX. I also am someone that uses quotation marks with native speaker quite consistently now, thanks to Jean-Marc's intervention, I think. But there is a danger, I think, here that if these terms continue to be used in folk discourse about language, and we move away from that towards, L1, LX, or whatever we decide, multi-competent users, whatever we want, yeah, are we then polarizing between these two in a way that is potentially unhelpful? Are we also, how can we also ensure that by changing terms, we don't also just add a layer of mystification, leave the ideology, but just add, another sort of layer of masking tape over it to make it just less obvious. And I think those scales that Talia showed us, I think they are a really good example of that, where we read them and we don't see native speaker, but somehow we just think it, yeah. And that's something that's incredibly difficult to avoid. Yeah, that really sort of requires a lot of thinking. Okay, I think I'm gonna leave it there. I'm sorry for not being able to show you the slides, but as I said, I think what we can agree at the end is if people are okay to share the slides or part of their slides, they can send them to me and I can then forward them to everyone registered. Yeah, so we can, we can, you know, if anyone wants to see slides and take note of the references, yeah, we can definitely do that. Okay. All right, I'm gonna end it there, yeah. Let's maybe move on to a bit of a discussion. I am conscious of the time. We've got 20 minutes left. We might run over a little bit, but if any of the speakers needs to run off, please do let me know, yeah. Okay, I think can I first of all ask, do any of the speakers have any comment on what anyone else has said? Jean-Marc and Talia, I sense that there is scope for a bit of a discussion between you two. I wonder if Jean-Marc has any reply to that.
Well, I think it's great that we have a debate about this, because it's obvious that we couldn't possibly agree on everything. I mean, we are academics after all, so we have their own unique views. We come from different areas, we have different perspectives, we have different life experiences, and there is no single truth out there. So, you know, we defend our proposals, but this is not a matter of life and death. I'm perfectly, you know, I could live with Talia's proposal. I agree with the things you said, Christoph. It's simply that, you know, I want to defend my position, and I put in the chat that I don't think that the word user has intrinsically these negative connotations.
Look at a dictionary definition, and you will see a secondary meaning listed. That is an objective thing, and I'm telling this to a linguist. Go to a corpus, look at how the term is used. Yes, it's used as digital user, but it's also used as in a very negative way as well. So these are two secondary meanings, and I think that linguists can't turn back and saying, oh, we're not looking at these. These are objective things.
Yeah. I disagree there, but that's okay. I had this view of, you know, the Chomskyan, but in fact Saussurean view of long, which is something that a community shares, and that it's a language where, in fact, you have no choice but to use the language that is around you. And I also liked Vivian Cook's arguments for the word user, that it's more inclusive because it includes people who don't necessarily speak the language. And the point was that, you know, what if you're a language signer, you don't speak, then it's a bit awkward then to be called a native speaker of British Sign Language, because you don't speak. So I buy that argument. I think as linguists that we need to be as inclusive and broad as possible. But, you know, I mean, it's just my view, so it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just to jump in there, yeah, I think that Jean-Marc, maybe one of the things here is, I mean, I remember, just as an aside, that in Slovenia, where I'm originally from, the equivalent of the word user was at some point criticized because it instrumentalizes language too much. It's not in line with the idea of, you know, this is our national language. So, you know, obviously, I mean, they are, you know, these are quite varied discourses, right, where there will be very different terms. Probably one of the issues here is I'm wondering, well, I think that the difficulty that there is here is, as long as we're looking for an equally universal equivalent, we're still likely to go down a kind of, basically an roundabout, coming back to the same sort of idea, right? Because, just as all users are different, right? Some are listeners, some are speakers, some are writers, some are signers, right? This is probably, in my sense, I think we're, moving away from this universality of like, just like IELTS is not all forms of speech and all forms of reading and all forms of writing. They are very specific subtypes, registers, genres that test would say something about. Probably that would be a path forward from a sort of social perspective, that, what we're talking about, what kind of use, are you a proficient writer of academic English? Okay, well, that's one thing, right? Are you a fluent speaker of let's say everyday English? That's a very different kind of competence, right? Probably the issue here is that as long as we're trying to fit all of those under one big umbrella, that's where we're sort of going, not going anywhere. Yeah. Dijin, what do you think? Have you got anything to add?
I just thought about maybe the term itself, like native, non-native, L1, L2. I think it kind of provides the rigid categorization for the language user and the learner too. So probably what we can do is that I know that bilinguals and bilingualism has its own baggages and burdens onto the language learners, but it might be interesting to open that up as a new identity categorization where language learners or language users or anybody else can be related to. And that's what I'm doing with a lot of my students. Even though they learned English for about like 20 years, they still afraid to identify themselves as a bilingual because of a certain baggages. So there might be an option that we can think about to be openly talk about with the other people, so that we're not really putting the individuals into the extremes, rather than they're going to be a continuum.
Absolutely, yeah. To value everything that we've got. It certainly would be in the spirit of, if we look at big terms in applied linguistics now, translanguaging, English as a lingua franca, global Englishes, right, all are trying to sort of broaden the idea of competence, go beyond, toward plurilingual kind of vision, unitary repertoire, all these kind of things. Yeah. I wonder if we could get, I know that you guys have been very good at writing comments and questions, and also answering questions. I see a couple. I wonder if anyone from the audience has anything that they want to share. Perhaps we could, I think, can we ask maybe people who have got an opinion to share on this issue to put their hand up, so we can get you to speak with us? Anyone? Yes. Okay. I see. Hin Mashra.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really enjoyable. Like I was listening, and also because I'm sharing the same perspective. I'm doing English and lingua franca and translanguaging from EMI, English as a medium of instruction. I'm looking at the EMI from ideological perspective, like they're spreading native speakerism, and also the English ownership. Beside that is monolingualism. Like English as a medium of instruction is advertising by using only English. They don't allow to use other languages. Also, they advertising for native speakerism in somehow, and this is because we are, for example, I'm from Saudi Arabia. Most the students and teachers, all of them, they are non-native, and each one of them, they expect each other they are native. Students expect teachers to be native, and teachers expect students to be native. So when they come to the classroom, they are shocked that everyone, they are not native, and they found that students will not learn from the teachers because they are not native. But they are really good in English when they speak English. They can deliver content subject in more comprehensible way. But students said, okay, we will not learn English from this way, because they have high expectation that the teachers will be native speakers, or at least they are Saudi or Arab. They are coming from Anglophone countries. They expected that they will come and they have maybe near like native speaker. So there is a lot of expectation from both sides, but then I'm trying through the data analysis, data collection, to say native speakerism is not important to be native. And as long as you understand the lecture, you understand what teacher said, why you are looking for native speakerism, or why you have high expectation. So when I ask students if they like to develop their language, most of them, they want to be like native, because they are in a position that we are studying EMI, we want to continue our higher education, we want to be like native speakers. So they have this mentality about native speakerism is the best, and this is my desire. And many of them, they think that to make people understand me, I need to be a native speaker. But this is not the case. So as long as you understand, so you don't need to be native speaker. So I can't find even the teachers, I guess they reach the level to be content what they have. Okay, as long as I can deliver my subject, I'm fine. I'm not looking for native speakers or to be native to deliver but they feel sometimes they are reluctant when they go to conferences. They feel ashamed, they feel embarrassed because their language, because they said, okay, then we know that I'm not native. But if you deliver your content very good and in a comprehensible way, why you are thinking in this way? So still need more confidence to use their English or Saudi English or Arabian English to be influenced in their L1. So this is what I'm looking for in English as a video instruction.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've chosen a really current research topic. Yeah, I mean, English as a medium instruction is such a key trend at the moment. Not always positive, I think. And very definitely, I think, in correlation with this concept of, let's say, native speakerism, and certainly also the commercialization of that. Yeah, certainly I can think of English medium programs that are sold as almost like, oh, come here and you'll study with white native speakers. Yeah, that is very characteristic of elite educational settings. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We've got Valentin. Valentin has raised his hand. Valentin, hello.
Hello. Yes, it was really nice listening to all of you. And actually, I'm doing a PhD research topic. This is the core of my research, or it would be comparing native English teachers with non-native English teachers. And it's partially due to the personal journey I've taken teaching English for the last 12 years. I spent almost 8 years in Thailand, about 3 years in Korea. So I'm drifting in between different identity shifts, performing the role of a native English teacher while teaching as a non-native English teacher. This is how I see it. Actually, I've read a lot about this topic, and what I can say is that I believe we drift between two extremes in the context of the native, non-native speaker dichotomy. And we scholars and researchers basically end up legitimizing or validating this divide between native and non-native English teachers. And recently, so on the one hand, we have people talking about native speakerism. On the other hand, we're saying, okay, we should we should forget about the native speaker standards. Intelligibility is more important. It's more important how you communicate meaning. And actually, we're not doing justice to the whole debate and to the teaching profession and to the students. And what is more important, I believe, is to look at how native and non-native English teachers learn from one another and the journeys they take towards reducing that gap. In other words, how native English teachers can become non-native English teachers so they can perform the role of non-native English teachers, and how non-native English teachers can also learn from native English teachers. And recently I read an article by someone which was a very controversial article, and I partially agree with it. And it was basically, the author said, it doesn't mean that because I'm a native English teacher, I'm monolingual. And it doesn't mean that because I'm a native English teacher, I cannot teach grammar. And he felt he was the object, he was the victim of that divide. He said, you know, I was not being given, and he's teaching in Japan, I don't want to say his name, but he said he was not given freedom in terms of teaching what he wanted to teach. He wanted to teach grammar, but he was being portrayed as the typical native English teacher, and he felt the victim of that policy. So I think, you know, it goes both ways. And again, what I'm rather interested in terms of seeing, and I hope my research will take me there, is looking at basically the identity shifts teachers are going through and how their beliefs, cultural backgrounds are manifested in their relationships with students. And I was lucky in Thailand. Basically, Thailand opened my eyes because at Assumption University of Thailand, we had teachers from everywhere, native English teachers from different countries, non-native English teachers from different countries. And I remember it didn't matter anymore who a native or non-native was. Students could build their informed opinions about who the teacher was. And their opinions were based on teachers' ideological, epistemological beliefs, the jokes they were making in class. And I remember sometimes students would tell me, oh, you teach exactly the same way as the Italian teachers. You, the European teachers, always make the same jokes. And then another student would say, the American teachers were teaching in one way, and I like them in this particular regard. And I think that's where the research should be going to, how teachers, cultural backgrounds, even learning backgrounds are manifested in their relationships with students and with what's going on in the classroom, rather than only focusing on the command of the language or language proficiency. Language proficiency is a very small aspect of language learning. And we are not, in such a way, we are not basically helping students build associations with the language. You know, sometimes students will tell me, no, I don't want to learn English because I'll necessarily use it. Actually, I don't care about that. I want to learn English because I want to learn English idioms from Americans, or I want to be able to read English. And I think this is it's really worth investigating, and I hope my research takes me there.
Yeah, thanks, Valentin. Yeah, I think what you're raising here is this diversity, right? That is around these concepts, how we're very far beyond really this simple dichotomy. Yeah, as soon as you look at a community of people, you will find huge variation in what does this actually mean to them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Valentin. Okay, I'm looking here. I've got Kaveh. Is that right, Kaveh? Put your hand up, Kaveh. Yeah. Okay. Can we? Okay, we come back. We come back if you come to us. Oh, you can't open your camera. If you can open your microphone, you're welcome to speak.
Okay, hello and thank you, everyone. I couldn't open my camera. Probably one of the line of the research could be studied in both local and global, let's say, extreme. It could be the cognition of policymakers and decision makers. When I am working in Turkish context and I see nearly in almost all, let's say, job advertisement even though they are recruiting expatriate teachers who have got enough expertise, let's say, professional knowledge, and etc., you see all, let's say, advertisement, they repeatedly have mentioned the teachers should be native speaker of American, US, and they should have those citizenship passport, and etc. Probably one of the issues, I would like to quote a sentence by Michel Foucault: no sentence is by itself innocent. There is an ideology behind every sentence. And the people who have power are trying to indoctrinate their opinion as a fact to the people. And why they believe that native speaker, let's say teacher or experts, are better than non-natives. Probably there should be some studies on the people's cognition, let's say, who are disseminating such ideas or empowering such ideas. And it's still maybe long ago, we have seen in ELT native speakerism and so many articles, even in TESOL, if I'm not making mistakes. Professor Ali Fuad Salvi is also, let's say, chair of non-native speaker and native speaker section. There has been a lot of study. Still we see that there is such a dichotomy. Still people are insisting on it, and still they are saying native speaker, non-native. Probably it could be classified as professional, non-professionals, well-professional, I don't know, well-educated. And that's all. I would like to share my comments with colleagues and professors. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, this issue about let's say what gets projected onto these concepts, I think is quite quite curious, quite interesting. Yeah. The good and the bad, right? Race, education, access to some sort of deep cultural knowledge. These are quite interesting sort of hidden meanings here. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's go to the next one. I think it's Yunfang.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
Hi. I have a question to the Professor Talia E. Sachs. Yeah, I'm from China, so there is a problem in China. Most Chinese students are good at reading and writing in tests, such as IELTS, TOEFL, GRE, etc. And sometimes they can achieve the level of native speakers, or even the score will be higher than the native speakers. But their listening and speaking is not satisfactory. So we as teacher, what can we do to deal with this imbalance among listening, speaking, reading, and writing? So, sometimes even the teachers can have this problem. So can you share your opinions on this problem? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, what you're talking about is sort of jagged profiles of students who tend to sort of do better on either receptive skills than productive skills, or who do better sort of in written medium than oral medium. And there is this issue in many countries in East Asia, for example, where, teacher proficiency is an issue. And we're not talking about sort of adhering to a native speaker standard. We're talking about sort of, in a way that where it would be high enough and adequate to be able to teach. I mean, when I first became interested in research on intelligibility, my research question was, is intelligibility enough? And I was looking at international teaching assistants. And in some contexts, I mean, I think intelligibility is part of it, but maybe sometimes teaching ability, in the context of teachers is also important. I mean, I don't think that there is, a magic bullet in terms of how to improve the proficiency level, oral proficiency level, for example, of teachers. I mean, there have been, I mean, AI has some role potentially. I mean, you know, maybe using, I mean, I'm not advocating using automated sort of tools necessarily to teach English speaking. But I think probably it may be that is better than nothing. So there are, it's quite a big question on how you tackle these things. I think that certainly more emphasis in testing sometimes drives, and having a speaking component in high stakes tests can drive changes in the classroom. And listening is slightly easier to tackle. I think, you know, sort of a global English's perspective would be good, just exposing learners to different varieties, and you know, tests can kind of drive that sort of reform. But it is quite complex. I think there is a teacher training element to it, and certainly speaking often gets left behind in assessment because of sort of a lack of subjectivity, and sometimes there may not be people who you know, could evaluate it. So it's an involved question. I don't think I can give a very clear and straightforward answer in this context. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Professor Jean-Marc, can you do something with your psychology?
I think the positive psychology angle is important because I think it's fundamental really to all teaching, that we teach students who don't know much yet, but we need to be encouraging in the fact that they can progress, and that not everybody needs to get to the very top and the very highest standard. That obviously as teachers, we want them to progress and we do our best to help them forward, but we tell them to be realistic too. And that, you know, you can learn to cook or play an instrument or do karate, and you don't need to become a black belt or, you know, reach the highest levels of competition to enjoy what you're doing and for it to be successful. So I think that the view from positive psychology is that we shouldn't see glasses as being half empty, but rather as half full. That said, it shouldn't stop us from fighting for social justice. And I think that if you're doing the same job, being born with a language or having acquired that language later in life, you should have the same salary, because you shouldn't be judged on something that you had no control over.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think here is if I can just add something here, yeah, I get the sense that we have, you know, the same sort of situation in the Thai context, that very often students are highly capable in reading very specific types of texts, and then are, you know, have much less, say, proficiency, competence, however you want to call it, in certain other types of language use. If I can reframe the debate a little bit, isn't that normal for most speakers from a social perspective, that, you know, our competence is never even, right? Our competence is always asymmetrical, is always uneven, is always, you know, tinted more to this side, to that side. So here, you know, what is very often, I think, framed as a problem is in some ways a sort of normal consequence of the language ecology, let's say, around the students, right? So, you know, students don't watch Netflix much, for example, or, you know, whatever other HBO, whatever other kind of English speaking TV, yeah. So they don't listen much in their daily lives, right? So that doesn't develop much. But if they do, then it will. That's the.
Christoph, can I disagree with you?
Okay,
in high
sure.
stakes testing, usually reports go by 4 skills. And yes, that's kind of an old way of thinking about things, dividing up the language learning pie into speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But that's what's done. And there have been, studies looking at predictive validity. How well does how well do your scores on a high stakes English language proficiency test predict performance at university, for example? And there is work, for example, by April Ginther and Kathy Elder looking at, and Jun Yang looking at sort of jagged profiles, because some people do come in with sort of more, with less disparity between productive and receptive skills. And then there are other students who have very high scores on listening and reading and lower scores on speaking and writing. And it tends to be speaking and particularly writing that is consequential for grades in higher education. And we know that students who do have, these more jagged profiles tend to perform less well academically than students who come in with more, with more even profiles. So I agree with you about people not being even on every skill, and that's the case. But when it comes to assessment, it's not thought of in that way. It's very much 4 skills still kind of paradigm, and there are differences. And I think that this is sometimes being taken into account now in admissions decisions. There is some evidence to suggest that this is an issue. I mean, I think there is a role for curriculum and policy in driving some change, but certainly I think starting with sort of teachers and teacher training, I think that's a really crucial element. There's not one way of going about it. It's quite a complex kind of thing. But I think moving away from sort of grammar translation style instruction, focusing on real, use the term uses. I don't have a problem with it as a verb of language is important. But yeah, that would be what I would say. But sorry to disagree. I think I'm talking about something different than you were, Christoph. I just wanted to bring in that point.
Sure. I mean, well, I think if we bring the testing perspective in, right, it depends what you're testing for, right? And, what's the objective? If you're doing IELTS because you're going to study at a British university, that is one thing, right? If you're
Absolutely.
a run-of-the-mill high school graduate trying to get into a Chinese medium university with maybe some English, then we're talking about, another profile that's required for academic success, right? Yeah. Okay. So we agree, actually, right?
Oh, absolutely. Depends on what is required and what language testers call the target language use domain. Why do they need to? Yeah, absolutely. Well articulated. Thank you.
Okay. I'm conscious of Hedwig still has a hand up. Okay, and I'm not gonna forget about you, but I just want to go to a point from the written chat, just so that people there are not feeling marginalized. And there was a point here that I thought would be that people have been chatting about, and I thought would be interesting for us, which is the question of, is this specific to English, or how specific to English this is? The idea of, native versus non-native, this sort of divide. How much does that, sort of, how specific is that to that particular, very specific language? If I can kick this one off, okay, certainly in my L1 community, which is Slovenian, so, a little country in the middle of Europe, I would say that certainly the native speaker nativeness ideology is very much there. If anything, probably to a much sharper, much sharper iteration that we would find with English, because it's coupled with an extremely powerful prescriptive discourse around language in general. Yeah. Where even not, by far not all Slovenian speakers are okay. Actually, it's only the very high educated uber standard language which is positively evaluated, sort of, when we're talking about the discourse. So certainly that's there. I'm curious if any of our other speakers have any comment on the other languages in your that you are working with, or your own, let's say, L1 communities. What do you think about that?
I think it all depends. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's all depending on where you are. So for example, when I'm thinking about South Korea, we do have a historical discourse, like historical background of US dominance, Japanese imperialism, all that things are giving a huge social value onto the English. That's one of the reasons that when I'm thinking about native speaker, it immediately brings me the image of English and English native speaker, not the other languages. And I am working as a director for the foreign language program in my university. And one of the interesting dynamics that I just noticed is that when I'm looking at the English faculty members, most of them are the so-called as a native speaker. We have more than 30 of them. And only 2 of them can able to speak Korean. And all the other faculty members are assumably monolingual native speaker. But when I'm talking to other foreign language faculty members, we have a Japanese and Chinese and other foreign languages, and they are all proficient in Korean. And none of the students have an issue that they could speak, the teachers actually could speak Korean. And I think when I'm looking at the case of South Korea, non-nativeness and native teacher baggages are only very much applicable to English. Not that I'm saying that the students prefer to have a native teachers for other foreign languages, but it's lesser pressure for the other languages, I would say.
If I may come in at this point, Christoph, I think in fact that attitudes towards foreign language users of a language that is your first language, that it depends really on the status of the language. So I do think that in Slovenia, that maybe more Slovenians would actually be impressed that a foreigner is actually trying to speak their language and is making mistakes, but it's making the effort to learn a language that is not a world language. So I think that there would probably be a more positive attitude towards that foreign language user. Of course, the moment you are a foreign language user, you indicate that you do not belong to the in-group because your accent marks you out as not being part of that in-group. And I guess that's kind of a natural human reaction anywhere. But yes, I agree that everything depends on who is talking where and when to whom and what is the goal of the interaction.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, certainly, I'm thinking, I mean, there's certainly been cases of L2 speakers of Slovenian in public discourse, but few and far between, yeah. You know, partly we're talking about very specific language with a very diverse morphology, which is quite a challenge for L2 users, learners, speakers, however you want to call them, yeah. Yeah, okay. Certainly there. Talia, did you want to, from the Canadian perspective, complex bilingual?
Yeah, it is very complex, and there's a lot of trilingualism, multilingualism in some parts, especially I'm thinking of Montreal, where I lived for a while. I mean, I don't really have much to add at this stage, just that I echo what you said, Nathan, in the chat about the need for much more thinking about other target languages. So it's good to hear sort of experiences. I'd like to see more research on that. And I think there is some, but certainly English continues to dominate. And, you know, but yeah, that would be great to see other work done. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, just to add something that I've thought of at some point, would be interesting to know, for example, diaspora, for example, Chinese diaspora speakers, you know, how would they be evaluated as native speakers, as owners of Chinese, for example, in Southeast Asia, vis-a-vis Chinese citizens of the Republic of China, or the People's Republic of China, right? So that would be an interesting question, yeah? Who has validity, right? Okay, Hedwig.
Christoph, can I just add? I think phenotype has something to do with it, like the way that you look before you open up your mouth. I mean, people make judgments just based on how you look, and I think that is a universal human thing. Skin color, whatever, your stance, the clothes you're wearing, they make assumptions about who you are, where you come from, And so it's not all about verbal language, I think.
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah. I just to add
absolutely,
that.
definitely. I mean, it's a multimodal thing. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Hedwig, we made you wait. I'm sorry. You're the last one with your hand up. Tell us. You have a question or a comment for us?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a comment and I suppose a bit of my perspective as a language teacher. I teach primarily English, and I've been seeing this sort of pattern emerging of the kinds of people, or the people who reach out to work with me. I work privately, and I get a lot of people kind of asking, can you help me with my accent? Can you help me to sound more native and that kind of stuff? And the thing that I think is important also to think about when we're looking at learners of English is that, or learners of any language really, is what is the deeper why for learning, for wanting to become a sort of quote unquote native, right? So because a lot of the time, actually, the deeper why isn't even about language. It might be about wanting to feel included, or wanting to have a sense of belonging, or something like that. And, you know, I just think it's something that, you know, when you feel like you're being excluded from a society or from your workplace, if you speak English at work and that kind of thing, then, you know, there's just so many other levels that we don't talk about. We say, oh, let's work on how you pronounce the W sound. But really, it's about so much more than that. I really appreciate everybody who's spoken today. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I guess there we get again, right? It's such a complex discourse around native speaker, non-native speaker, right? And probably the solution going forward is contextualizing, right? Looking at what do people project onto this, and in what context does this make sense? In what context does it not? Yeah, that's probably the certainly I can get behind the idea that we need to move away from notions of universality in language. Yeah, that's definitely definitely something that is, I think, a good conclusion for our discussion here. Yeah, I really have to thank everyone for joining us today. We're 23 minutes past the posted end time, but we still got 100 people here, which is really great. I really must apologize for the technical issue, but we got it there in the end. I want to just point out a couple of things. There is a link to an evaluation form in the chat right now, just to help us justify our activity to our faculty. So please, if you've got the time, fill that out really quickly. We're going to send that link also in an email, and I'm also going to ask the speakers if they can share a PDF version of their slides, and I will also send out a link to that in the same email. Okay. Yes, and in the chat there's a question, may I know where could I rewatch the video? We are recording. I'm gonna have to edit the files to make that work, but I will upload it to YouTube, and the link will again be sent out. Okay. If you've registered on the Google form to receive a certificate, yeah, then you will get a link to these things. Okay. So if you haven't done that yet, but you want to get a link, make sure that you go to the Google form, put your email there, put your name there, and it will be sent out to you. Okay. All right. Thank you very much to everyone, to the 4 speakers, so the 3 speakers for giving their time. Really appreciate it. Yeah, everyone is super busy at every university in the world. So I really appreciate you giving your time. And also to the audience for coming today. Okay. I hope to see you at the next one of these events, which will come in the next year. Okay. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thanks very much, Christoph. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Great for your questions. Bye.
Bye-bye. Everyone take care.